The Warhammer 40k universe is inherently anti-progressive. Now I'd like to clarify that this isn't meant to be a simple culture war video where I complain about what's happening with the beloved franchise. Although it kind of is, since 40k is the current prize for one of the more recent battles all over social media. So touching a bit on that aspect is inevitable. But my purpose with this video is to go beyond pop politics. I'll attempt to analyze a theory of history and perhaps some political philosophy within the world-building context of the 40k galaxy as it is presented. And in so doing, I hope to generate a conversation about the idea of progress. You see, progress, both social and technological, is naturally inhibited by the very nature of the Warhammer universe. The 40k setting operates more on cycles, where humanity rises to fall, then rises again, and falls again. Like in this quote. The technological marvels upon which its dominion of the galaxy is founded are long gone. No man now knows how many times humanity has soared to lofty heights of achievement only to plummet once more to the depths of barbarity. The science that caused both advancement and debasement is now the subject of superstition and fear. Dark Heresy Guidebook, page 15, I think. And who can forget this incredible quote that defines the entire setting? Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim dark future there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods. This idea stands in stark contrast to the Whig theory of history, which is more common in our era. It's the one most normies believe in, and what's presented in seminal science fiction like Star Trek, where history is seen as a series of steps towards a better future. Things are always getting better in the long run, from cavemen to rocket ships, and from slavery and human sacrifice to universal human rights. But here, 40,000 years in the future, we still have slaves and human sacrifice. But in space! And we also have primitive cavemen flying in rocket ships for good measure, depending on which world the character hails from. In the Whig theory of history, the bringer of change becomes the protagonist of history, because history only moves forward to better eras and never regresses to harsher conditions. Therefore, those who bring social change are not seen with that much hostility, because if it's bad change, history would naturally purge it. In fact, it's people advocating for a conservative or traditional approach that are seen as suspicious a lot of the time. Because if newer is always better for everyone, then seeking to preserve the past is interpreted as inherently unjust or oppressive to one group or another. It's one of the reasons why the word fascist is thrown around a lot. But in 40k, social change becomes dangerous because it's more likely something caused by the entropy of the universe. Here, personified by paranormal Reddit mods, the four gods of chaos. So the right side of history is not getting purged, for heresy. Civilization is always at the edge of collapse because its own existence isn't guaranteed, so progress would be much less so. Therefore, in this scenario, the trads win. There's more to lose by risking change than maintaining tradition, as the cult Mechanicus is well aware. Keep in mind, however, that progressivism isn't exclusively a political issue. The progressive versus conservative thing is mostly pop politics for the American context. In political theory, progressivism is the belief that history cannot or should not ever move backwards, that we're always moving to newer, unprecedented historical eras, where we're developing something new. Both right-wing and left-wing ideologies can either be progressive or rejected. Like anarcho-primitivism, which is a left-wing ideology that believes we should basically return to the Stone Age, because only then we'll all be equal, but in the mud. And the Futurist Party, in Italy, merged with fascism, and moved very much to the right. Both the left-wing and the right-wing iteration of progressivism is explored in 40k, and both fail rather miserably. My point is that the grim-dark universe of 40k is hostile to both left-wing progressive values and right-wing progressive values, which I'll elaborate on in a bit. Anyway, Warhammer 40k portrays a universe where the natural state of life is war, and peace is the result of order imposed by an artificial state preferably governed by a powerful sovereign, like what Thomas Hobbes says, which makes stability more important than progress. The Imperium of Man is famous for being over the top, with its hellish hive worlds covered in factory pollution and non-stop acid rain. And of course we can't forget its massive military of billions of disposable soldiers thrown into an endless cosmic meat grinder and ginormous genetically enhanced super soldiers fighting furries. I'm not even kidding. 40k is so insane that the Flash Gets parody animation fits perfectly with canon. But again, what you have to understand when it comes to the absurdity of the Imperium of Man is that its nature is a direct result of its setting. Humans and Eldar tried other models of galactic civilization and it always crumbled under the weight of the universe. Why? Because of the very nature of reality. When this universe began to form, one of the first things to emerge were the Citan, that feed off of stars and planets to exist. This principle that to live you must devour something else is the core of life. Then, when the Old Ones become the first interstellar civilization, they formed a temporary paradise where they lived forever and went around seeding life on various planets until another civilization, called the Necrontyr, went to war against them because they were born in a crappy planet and had to fight for a better existence. Which leads to the paradise that the Old Ones built for themselves being wiped out after the Necrontyr joined forces with the ever-hungry Citan. The historical eras of the galaxy change after catastrophes caused by the inherent evolutionary hunger that drives living organisms, whether for pleasure, improvement of circumstances, or just plain old animal instinct to devour. Once the previous era collapses, the cycle begins again. This is a running theme in this universe. The Star Trek-like technologically progressive human civilization that first spread to the stars in the dark age of technology was destroyed because of unfettered technological progress, which made humanity build artificial intelligence systems it couldn't control. The Eldar created a post-scarcity society of a pleasure paradise, which made them so sexually depraved and degenerate that the entire civilization collapsed. And billions of their people died horrific deaths as their souls were consumed by the manifestation of their excess. Because the Chaos Gods in general are always beyond the veil of material reality and seeking to tempt mortals into dysfunctional pathological behavior that they can use to control and possess the souls of those of weak faith. And the Tyranids represent the relentless hunger of nature, since they're biological intergalactic predators that seeks to devour all biomass in the Milky Way. But they also use gene-stealer cults that infiltrate human society to prepare planets for invasion. This is not a universe that rewards the mainstream progressive values of diversity, equity, and inclusion of an open society inspired by Karl Popper and associated with the American left. And it also does not reward the small government limited by individual rights, freedom of speech, and pursuit of happiness, like in a liberal society inspired by John Locke, associated with the American right. And I mean the original definition of liberal here. And this is because all that just gives room for aliens and demons to subvert your society from the inside out. Instead, this universe rewards hierarchy, cohesion, and exclusion, as well as intense discipline. And by reward, I mean you get to keep existing in this bleak reality. In any case, if the Imperium of Man starts having gender affirmative action quotas for the castrated, muscle-bound murder machines of the Space Marines, it'll feel very out of place and very forced. The Tau faction is the closest thing to an inclusive society in the setting, but even they have a caste system, so not very egalitarian, and their native utopian beliefs are getting crushed the more they learn about just how insane their universe is. Their plot arc is them being forced to become more brutal to survive.
For the Tau Empire, a gene stealer from High Fleet Gorgon made for a fascinating test subject. Their mistake was that after it was captured by the Earthcast, and during their substantial analysis, a worker was implanted with the germ seed. Over the following 20 years, Earthcast laboratory workers increasingly noticed many distorted anatomies throughout the labs. But this intriguing development was actually accepted as the philosophy of the greater good promotes a tolerance of alien life forms. It wasn't until a bloody schism broke out that the Firecast was brought in, and they had a hard time clearing out the extensive underground research facilities.
And as you can imagine, due to our current times, Games Workshop, the company that owns Warhammer, is in a bit of a conundrum with this fictional setting, because the corporate elites in the West adopted a progressive and egalitarian set of values, which they feel obliged to defend and spread through their platforms. But it's literally impossible to do that with 40k without destroying the entire setting, because it's completely antithetical to the very idea of progress. Which makes sense because left-wing progressive values are based on Rousseau's noble savage idea of nature being inherently benign and providing equally for everyone. And these axioms are precisely the opposite of the Warhammer Milky Way galaxy, putting it mildly. And it gets especially awkward when it comes to inclusivity of sexual identity. Not in the 40k universe as a whole, because, there's an entire faction that includes all the identities that you would want in that department. But I'm talking about how one of the writers was caught trying to shoehorn gender transitioning into the Imperium of Man. But it doesn't make sense because not only is this a universe where sexual activity and pleasure have to be tightly disciplined. Otherwise, an interdimensional literal sex fiend will infect your society with temptation and unravel it from the inside. But androgynous, non-binary sexuality is associated with decadence and societal collapse. because Slaneesh is highly associated with that. From having several different pronouns to also influencing his/her followers into having surgical alterations to their bodies. And Slaneesh followers often become hermaphrodites, with a female breast on one side and a male chest on the other. And just look at this symbol of Slaneesh. Doesn't it remind you of something? And if you think this is awkward for Games Workshop, wait till you find out how in Warhammer lore, artists and political elites easily fall under the sway of Slaneesh and spread his/her influence in their societies so that it can be destroyed by chaos. Which means that a lot of this ESG stuff and pushing this message makes GW resemble Slaneesh cultists in their own lore. But I want to make clear that this doesn't apply to simple homosexuality though. Historically speaking, lesbianism has been typically tolerated by several hegemonic empires, and warrior cultures like Japan have had homosexuality enshrined in their books like the Hagakure, which is about obedience to your lord, and if your lord wants you to take his sword up your scabbard, you're obliged to obey.
Japan is the greatest, wonderful culture of manly love.
So the few cases of homosexuality that you see perfectly tolerated in the Imperium of Man, in several of the books, as outlined by Major Kill in one of his videos, is actually perfectly plausible for this kind of empire. It's the transgender surgeries and the fall of gender roles which would not make any sense in the patriarchal Imperium of Man. It would be immediately interpreted as Slaneesh activity. I mean, if our planet existed in the Warhammer universe, with Spanish politicians eating poop, sex-crazed political staffers filming anal prawn in the American Senate building, Lolita resorts for politicians, complete with pagan temples on those islands, and whatever the fuck the Irish were doing in Eurovision.
Do you know what makes me special? I'm a queer. Woo! And I'm a witch!
We would clearly be suffering a total Slaneesh takeover. I believe this idea of the Eldar's civilizational collapse due to hedonism is inspired by ideas expressed by famous academics like Camile Paglia, a professor from Yale who postulates a correlation between gender ambiguity with the fall of empires.
Was that my overview of history, my noticing that in late phases, you all of a sudden get a proliferation of homosexuality, of sadomasochism, of gender games and impersonations and masks and so on. So I believe we're in a late phase. We're in a late phase of culture.
So that the proliferation of cultural identities, the proliferation of all sorts of possibilities is actually a sign that we're
on the verge of collapse.
Yeah.
Yes, Western culture is in decline. There's absolutely no doubt about it, okay?
The West is definitely in decline, and this era will be the laughingstock of history. Even more so by the fact that it's painstakingly recorded by our digital devices. A lot of this crap on TikTok will be analyzed by future historians as symptoms of decline. Heck, it might even make it into their children's educational system. Like, okay kids, as we learned from our studies of American history, if you see one of your fellow classmates dressing up like a cartoon animal and meowing like a cat, bully the shit out of that mother hugger for the sake of our glorious empire! Following this line of thought, I believe that the universe of 40k can very much be a result of the Anglosphere's subconscious. It feels like the English-speaking world coming to terms with their own decline through a fictional narrative. The parallels are definitely there, down to the rise of the suspiciously named Tao, who seem oddly Chinese. They're a rising empire challenging the hegemony of the Imperium of Man. Even though China in real life has its own problems, atheist governments have never lasted more than 100 years, and China is fast approaching that expiration date. In any case, the subconscious story explanation would explain the profound skepticism of progress throughout the setting, seeing it as merely a stage before the inevitable downfall, since skepticism of the progressive view of history is getting more and more mainstream in the Anglosphere. The rise in popularity of cyclical theories of history since the pandemic are a sign of this. Not only a revival of interest in Oswald Spengler, but new academics developing very interesting theories of history, like Peter Turchin in his secular cycles and cleodynamics idea. We can all feel a decline, even academia, which is saying something. Progressive idealism in general, whether left-wing or right-wing, is unsustainable in Warhammer, as we see with the Great Crusade era of 30k, when the Emperor wasn't comatose and was walking around with a golden halo around his head. In that era, the Imperium was highly progressive in its founding mythology, but it was more of a supremacist type of manifest destiny, where the people is guaranteed to march to a bright future as the rulers of an expanding territory. It's the view where the people or empire in question are special, and will be the heralds of an unprecedented new era of civilization. All other civilizations were to be wiped out, subjugated, or cast aside. It also had a revanchist attitude against foreigners and notions of imperial revival and reclamation of lost territory, etc. And this failed spectacularly as the Imperium fell in the civil war of the Horus Heresy, where the noble warriors of civilization were now tearing it apart and put the Emperor into the Stephen Hawking position, but without a text-to-speech device. I mean, could you imagine? In fact, the 40K era of the Empire is different and less xenophobic by necessity. Guilliman was revived with the help of the Eldar, and the Tau have established diplomatic relations with the Imperium. The chauvinism of the founding Imperium turned out to be wrong, and collaborating with other civilizations against the raging of chaos that threatens them all is much more effective. But the older Imperium insisted on the great march of our civilization mentality by getting high up on supremacist ideals. The Imperium of Man was an incredibly idealist political project for humanity, seeking to embody a vision of a rationalist humanist utopia under the Emperor's guidance. Free from dogmatism, except for the imperial truth. Free from holy wars, except for a great crusade. And free to pursue knowledge, except for the psychic phenomenon. Hypocrisy aside, the very failure of the atheist, modernist, and humanist version of the Imperium, and the rise of a religious cult surrounding the leader as the backdrop of the entire setting, is at the core of what the Imperium and Warhammer as a whole is. Which is not fascism. I repeat, it's not fascism. Now I get where the misconception comes from. They're genocidal authoritarians who literally worship their government. I guess it looks sus to the average normie. And it's definitely sus, but way beyond anything popular political discourse is able to analyze. Now I don't want to sound like a pretentious twat, but that's because most people have the political vocabulary of like 5 words. And I have no doubt that many of the people in the creative team at Games Workshop actually think that they're being big brain boys, parroting fascism, and sticking up to those right-wingers, when they actually depicted something else entirely. Just like the big brain boys behind the Fallout Amazon show think that they're criticizing capitalism in that scene with Mr. House, when they actually perfectly depicted the anti-capitalist managerial revolution described by James Burnham, the paleo-conservative thinker. My point is, a lot of these people have no clue what they're doing when they shove politics into their stories. However, Games Workshop does have people with interesting and respectable insights, however. Like I said, it's a massive collaborative effort, and many are immensely praiseworthy in what they accomplished as creative talent. But regardless, the Imperium is actually much worse than fascism. Answer me this. Are the ancient Romans fascist? What about the ancient Assyrians? The Mongolians? What about the Aztecs? My point is, genocidal authoritarian societies are a dime a dozen in human history, and 40K is a commentary on the entirety of that history. It's why we have space Vikings. Are they fascist? 40K goes way beyond what the Italians did for a couple of decades in the 20th century. The Imperium of Man is an amalgamation of the most brutal, over-the-top elements of human history. The Roman imperial cult that worships the emperor, the brutal factory conditions from Victorian England, and the constant stream of thousands of human sacrifices to keep the universe going from the Aztecs. Not to mention World War I trench warfare fighting with the Krieg Corps and the Katakan Space Vietnam, etc. But it takes most of its inspiration from the Middle Ages. The Imperium of Man in 40K era is actually a postmodern neo-medieval state. The Imperium is a goth emo version of the Holy Roman Empire on several levels of shrooms and steroids, down to the emperor being mostly a figurehead presiding over a loosely connected federation of several planets, all with their own governments, cultures, and traditions. The state itself is ruled by several competing institutions that are all autonomous from each other, but united under a single central figure who doesn't really run anything. Not in the modern sense anyway. It's a classic case of medievalism, but a grim, dark version of it. Just because something is authoritarian and xenophobic and violent doesn't make it fascist, since these things, again, like I've said, have been around forever. My point is that a kaleidoscope of overlapping organizations and autonomous diverse regions with several different identities is not what Mussolini had in mind when he founded fascism. Fascism is a specific political doctrine written by Mussolini and Giovanni Gentili in their essay book called The Doctrine of Fascism. I get more into it in my video, It's Not Fascism, Bro. But for the sake of time, I had to cut off the part where I explain why Warhammer 40K isn't fascist, so I'm a little obliged to get into it here, but I won't go nearly as deep. But on screen now are the 5 main points in the Doctrine of Fascism. Those are me paraphrasing, but you can go read it yourself to check if I'm being accurate. But basically, it's the creation of a new man for a new era. A single party rule by only one political authority with totalitarian control over everything. No diversity is allowed, and the state is the mystical supersoul of the people. But one point many forget is the relentless march of history towards the future where humanity reaches ever greater heights. Which means that fascism is progressive. Yes, you heard that right. Again, I need to make this clear. Progressive in political theory means the belief that history never stands still or never moves backwards, and always looks to the future. It can be a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. Californian types don't have a monopoly on the term. I remember my feminist left-wing professor back in the UK telling me with no uncertain terms, fascism is progressive, when I was doing my master's, and she was herself a progressive. So I'm not making this stuff up for political ideological purposes. This is a typical position to take in academia. My point is the true nature of fascism clearly does not apply to the 40K Imperium. They're objectively anti-progress, and is extremely diverse in culture and government types, which is not tolerated in fascism. However, there's a very good argument to be made for the Imperium of Man being fascistic in the 30K era, when the Emperor was still around, since 5 principles are arguably somewhat fulfilled on some level, and has a lot of the same philosophical ideas of using the state to make a new type of super psyker man, and the state being the manifestation of a collective humanity, and to serve the state is to serve humanity, as the state molds the people, while the people don't really mold the state, etc. So yeah, it's almost fascistic, except for one thing. Fascism is mystical and anti-materialist in its philosophy, believing the state to be the spirit of the people, while the whole point of the Imperium was to be a materialist project that abhorred any mystical ideas. The lore does glorify the Emperor and his vision by making him an avatar of the Enlightenment in a way. He's inspired by the enlightened despot, which is a real thing in history. But he's worse because they were for religious freedom, which the Emperor was not. In the end, the 30K Imperium is also a mix of a bunch of historical stuff in one giant amalgamation to comment on human history. Only it's more totalitarian and centralized than the 40K era, which is more decentralized. Again, we should not see the entirety of human political history only through 2 decades of the 20th century. I feel obliged to repeat myself constantly in an attempt to maintain clarity in such controversial topics. Upon reflecting on the political and historical commentary of this franchise, I concluded that the whole point of Warhammer is to be satire of science fiction more than anything else. Because when you look at a lot of sci-fi, most fictional worlds are actually quite dystopian when you look under the surface. Some are even insanely grimdark by accident, but few in the audience notice just how dystopian it is, even if they're aware of some of it. The robot stories of Isaac Asimov are about how human science results in the creation of an artificial but sentient slave caste that needs to be constantly controlled through constant lobotomy and executions of deviants. In Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey, humanity was uplifted by a mysterious alien intelligence that plans to destroy it in the future. And even children's stories are insanely grimdark, like Ender's Game, where humanity brainwashes child soldiers to commit xenocide. It's the original Zeely sequence, and that fictional universe is 10 times worse than Warhammer 40K. And even highly progressive utopian visions meant to be portrayed as an absolute jolly time for humanity is actually just as dystopian as anything else, and made worse by its unbearable hypocrisy. Like the novel and film called Things to Come by H.G. Wells, where a technocratic scientific society takes over the world, undoing silly old traditions, and brings an unceasing, unprecedented era of progress, where humanity will conquer the stars. There's only one problem. In the end, it's just another highly doctrinal society, complete with an equivalent priest class, where people walk around in fancy robes, and the leadership of this society is actually a hereditary monarchy run by a family called, and I shit you not, Cabal. Cabal is their family name. Just why? You know what they say, one man's paradise is another man's retarded power fantasy with zero self-awareness. This is why jocks beating up nerds in school is actually a national service. And I say that as a nerd. Maybe if I'd been bullied more, I'd be able to have a relationship that lasts more than a few years. Anyway, it's disconcerting how most science fiction stories depict disturbing futures for humanity, and a lot of the times, those issues are a natural result of trying to interpret human society through merely a scientific and technological perspective. But it leads to an AI creating a rogue black ops organization that controls everyone in the shadows while they think they live in a progressive paradise, which is literally what happened in Star Trek, by the way. The United Federation Democracy is a lie! Space CIA runs the show! 40K was making fun of this by making the modernist rationalist Imperium of Man just collapse into a never-ending Middle Ages. It's actually really deep, bro. And in the end, the Imperium is run by the Inquisition since it has no oversight or restrictions on its power. Just like Section 31 in Star Trek. These two models of galactic civilization have more in common than you'd think, so it all comes full circle, and it's interesting. I might get into it in another video. Some fans think that 40K is a satire on religion and traditionalism because of all the religious lunatics in the setting, but I think they're wrong. Or if that was the intended satire, it failed spectacularly. The religious lunacy is only a thing 40,000 years in the future precisely because progressivism and the Enlightenment failed so monumentally. So let's reiterate everything that happens in the lore one more time. A technologically obsessed, scientifically oriented, progressive humanity created a technology it couldn't control in artificial intelligence, which almost destroyed it. Rationalist atheist humanism wasn't enough to satisfy and guide human civilization who needed to return to religion. The progressive Tao who challenged the Imperium are slowly starting to become more like the Imperium the more they interact with the hostile and paranormal forces of the universe. And the free-loving, sexually open society of the Eldar literally summoned a demon that destroyed their galactic civilization, and they are on their way to extinction. You can't have a satire of tradition placed in humanity's future, because that only occurs if progress failed first, thus ruining the satire. You need to place it in the past, like Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. That's the real satire of tradition. And it's boring, and no one reads it anymore except my really pretentious friends. 40K exaggerates every aspect of humanity and civilization to ridiculous proportions, from militant atheism to religious fundamentalism, and it does so by making fun of the effects of science and technology. Because science and tech increases human power but not human wisdom. So 40K envisions how tech enlarges every silly aspect of human civilization, not solving the problems, just making them bigger. That's why humanity is forced to stop developing technologically in the first place to avoid self-destruction. Which it has a point. Think about it. Has all our technology really solved hunger, disease, war, death? Or just made them into existential threats for the entire species? Now we can make unstoppable bioweapons and war can glass the entire planet. Yeah, some diseases like cholera were wiped out, but there's new ones. And although Fritz Haber saved us all from famine by synthesizing ammonia, climate change is a serious threat to the global food supply and might bring famine back in a big way. Like in Brazil, that insane flooding in the south ruined rice crops, which will increase the risk of starvation. Not to mention that both male and female fertility are declining at an alarming rate, with the diminishing health of sperm and ovaries, for reasons we don't understand. At this rate, it's only a matter of time before we mess with something we won't be able to handle. Which is why the science-loving emperor of mankind, who praises the gaining of knowledge, is a liar who limited human knowledge of the nature of the warp. Precisely because limits have to be placed on this thing. So basing your civilization on the unrestrained progressive pursuit of knowledge just makes you a silly billy in this universe. 40K also shows the flaws of the progressive assumption by showing how technological progress can make humanity move backwards in terms of social progress, by making knights in armor feasible again as a military asset, which makes modern universal suffrage and democracy unworkable. There's a reason why it only happened in our world with the advent of the musket, which is why the Techno Knights of the Space Marines are the most visible part of the franchise. They're a symbol of technologically reviving historical relics and how technological progress can cause apparent social regression. Because although social progress is possible to a degree via a lot of effort and sacrifice, you're limited by your historical conditions. It's for insights like this, in the setting of 40K, that people feel in a prime level that makes us enjoy it, despite most not wanting to live in this fucked up setting, and despite it being a rather unflattering depiction of humanity as a whole. Because the Imperium of man faces the darkness of the universe head on, and we see the heroism necessary to do so. Which is cool. It's more appealing than nerds walking around in color-coded pajamas rambling about shield percentages and eating poop scientifically magicked into food. I like Star Trek, by the way, and I watch it often, but I also enjoy making fun of it. The Klingons are the good guys, by the way. Anyway, if there's any point to 40K beyond pew 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 toy soldiers, then it's a contemplation on how bad things can get, especially after the failure of lofty utopian ideals. Which is interesting because the two most similar countries to the Imperium of man that exist in the world today are Russia and China, both of which are failed projects of progressive movements that promise to explore new and improved horizons for human society. Current China especially because it was founded by a progressive militant atheist who persecuted religion and did his best to wipe it out, only for him to be deified and worshipped. Check out the fiasco that was Mao's Mongol cult, or this massive golden statue of him built on a literal golden throne. You just can't make this shit up. It was removed because it was too much even for the Chinese government. But that doesn't stop the increasing amount of temples growing in the countryside that worship Mao as a god. And it's not just uneducated country folk, but also generals and officials, leftist scholars. It was starting to seriously freak out even the communist government, who was telling people to calm down on the zealotry. Or they were in 2015. Things may have changed since then. I've seen reports of the government low-key encouraging Mao worship now. North Korea is of course an example of a regime that totally embraces this deification, but this is just one aspect. When you look at China with its cheapness of human life, the terrible working conditions, with high death rates, the censorship, and the countless souls of industrial workers forced to feed the machine of a highly bureaucratic and inefficient empire, as well as the unbearable polluted air and the smog-covered sky, etc., you realize they're just LARPing as Victorian England. So much for the workers' paradise. The Foxconn suicide nets, by the way, in China are literally the most 40k shit you can ever see. China is the closest thing to the Imperium of Man in the real world, which is ironic, considering the Tao faction are obviously Chinese-coded, but they're more like Space Singapore, I'd say. The Russians have a similar thing going on, where they were once a lofty, expansionist, progressive atheist empire, operating under materialist doctrine, but there was a collapse of the central authority, and now their declining empire is sending countless people, including convicted criminals, off to die for the empire, even using obsolete and decrepit military equipment from a bygone era, with the nukes, missiles, and submarines now being blessed by priests of the now official state church. Some of these pictures are the most 40k images you'll ever see of real life, and they just don't end. There's countless pictures of this. It's gotten so bad that the Orthodox Church had to issue an order for priests to stop blessing weapons of mass destruction. I feel bad for my Orthodox brothers, actually, because corrupt government forces are trying to co-opt their beautiful spirituality for things that aren't very Christian. So please don't think I'm criticizing the Orthodox Church here. I'm not. I'm trying to point out the current state of the Russian government, which still venerates the Soviet atheist leaders like Lenin and Stalin, who initiated brutal persecution of religion in Russia. This weird syncretism with atheist militant progressives and traditional religion gives the whole place a 40k feel to it. The anti-progressive view of human history within 40k is absolutely crucial to its appeal across the board regardless of one's politics. Extremists from both the left and the right tend to love it even when the lore portrays both sets of values as misguided. But it's still appealing to everyone because 40k is about raging against the dark and that defiant and noble spirit that stands firm to the very end. It's also a cathartic way to express the decline of civilization and the changing of an era, which everyone is feeling right now, especially since 2020, regardless if they admit it or not. But I think its main appeal is how refreshing it is as a major franchise with a different perspective inherent to the setting that is distinct from the typical triumphalism of the current year. For now, anyway. The ESG money ruins everything. The danger of forcing a specific kind of progressive ideology to dictate every major piece of culture risks turning everything into this one blob where everything looks the same. Do we really need 40k to be yet another Marvel or Star Wars? If you make Warhammer lose its edge and mired by current year politics in a way that makes the characters and entire factions behave in a way that really doesn't make sense for the logic of the setting, then it won't be the thing that made it so popular in the first place, now would it? I myself am a Star Wars refugee. I was really into the Star Wars Expanded Universe back in college until it became a crappier, less well-written version of Marvel after Disney. And I know there's tons like me. The growing success of 40k over the years is directly correlated to Disney's mishandling of Star Wars, which was never a grim, dark reflection of human civilization, but it wasn't a mere product of entertainment either. It was King Arthur in space, with all the legacy that entails. 40k, as it is now, unwittingly captured a similar feeling of the eternal story like Star Wars did, by portraying civilization as an ever-repeating cycle, just like Dune before it. By portraying medievalism in space, it becomes an Arthurian story by default. And it does so by questioning the 4 assumptions of a progressive view of history. Here are the false assumptions. 1. The universe is inherently stable enough to guarantee progress forever. This is more the left-wing assumption of a necessarily benign universe, where the arc of history all but guarantees it, and we're typically progressing to a utopia of some kind. We're naturally evolving and nature is guiding the way. However, in truth, evolution doesn't lead to guaranteed development, but adaptation, which is not the same. You can increase in intelligence or lose intelligence or stagnate depending on the conditions. Like the Wall-E people, comfortable conditions cause decline. Also, entropy is inevitable, which will cause collapse that sets progress back. Which leads to the second assumption, that the chaos of entropy and conflict are what guarantees progress. Evolution through the eternal struggle to life. This is more the right-wing view. War as the great purifier. But in truth, too much chaos destroys everything, and it's more than likely that you'll eventually be destroyed by something bigger in this scenario. Eventually. Until entropy consumes everything in the heat death of the universe, making your development and struggles pointless, ultimately. Third assumption. Tradition is the enemy of progress. Untrue. Progress doesn't come from dismantling the past and resetting everything. That just makes you reinvent the wheel like an idiot. Or reinvent slavery, like what the Soviets did with labor camps, as opposed to moving beyond slavery, like the British monarchy did. True progress comes from building on the foundation that came before. Tradition just means the transfer of customs and ideas through the generations. Progressivism itself is a tradition of thought. If your tradition is to question and dismantle tradition, you won't progress, you'll destroy yourself in cognitive dissonance when your descendants obey the spirit of that idea by dismantling what came before, which means dismantling the idea of progress, which is what happened with postmodernism. Fourth assumption, embrace change. Newer is always better. Silly, of course. Not all change is good. You need to differentiate between what is progress and what is degeneration. Traditional knowledge becomes a great way to do that, because if a tradition was effective enough to last this long, it must know a thing or two about avoiding ideas or habits that would cause it to degenerate and die off. Progress through tradition. We progress by trying to live up to the eternal ideals instead of changing ideals because of dumb young people in universities who think they know better. The Warhammer 40k universe is a franchise that explores these four assumptions in the lore, and the story elements are narrative ways to express anguish at our own grimdark universe. In 40k, the warp will eventually engulf everything and destroy all life. It's pretty much a given. This is akin to the aforementioned heat death of the universe. But there is hope in 40k in the form of faith. The Emperor's faith in a vision he saw for humanity, and the faith that the Emperor will return. Or the Eldari, with their faith in one of their gods. It's the faith in divine intervention, basically. A transcendent power that defends the existence of life. Whether or not this faith is well-founded, 40k doesn't answer that. But it does answer that this faith is absolutely necessary to fuel civilization in a bleak universe. Now, it's important to note that progress does exist, but it's only one part of the cycle that happens before decline. Progress only occurs via great sacrifice, and it can be easily lost without proper vigilance. History moves forwards and also moves backwards, which is why the progressive types are only partly correct. However, I believe that history also moves upwards, while it moves forward and backwards, essentially being a three-dimensional spiral, motherfucker. I'm not on drugs, I swear. My point is, as the cycle of history keeps going through the eras, it does tend to progress higher than previous eras, but they also tend to collapse more catastrophically as well. And the same story of empires rising and falling seems to be told over and over, again and again, in a larger scale, but with the same archetypes repeating themselves over and over. Here's the grand narrative of civilization. The people used to live in the good times, in a golden age. Then things get bad as a tyrant takes over and oppresses the people in poverty and deprivation. Then comes a great leader that founds a new era. Then the people in this new golden era sin against the heavenly order, and they fall under the sway of a mad tyrant again, and are back into poverty and oppression, until a new great leader comes along, sets them free, and the cycle goes on and on. You see this cycle in several mythologies and religious narratives, and in the Bible, but especially in the book of Judges. And this is the grand narrative that repeats itself over and over in Warhammer lore, with Guilliman being the latest iteration of the great leader coming to the rescue for his people. This is also the story of the Book of Revelations, where the cycle is believed to play out for the very last time before the final end of history. It's the cycle of civilization, and it first played out with just a few cities in the Middle East, with Sargon of Akkad and whatnot, to now involving the entire planet. Having this cycle continue out into space on a galactic scale seems only natural, which is why the space opera genre seems so reactionary, with empires and monarchs and mystics being an internal aspect to civilization that just repeats itself over and over again. And this started with Isaac Asimov in his Foundation series, which is what inspired the entire genre. And Asimov was a very creative and progressive thinker, but even he had trouble imagining a way out of the cycle. But that's a topic for another time. And with that, I'd like to thank you, my patrons. You're the bulwark that keeps chaos from consuming this channel into oblivion. And thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.
All those nights I wish you'd stayed underneath the Milky Way. With every step our hearts implore, in the dark we long for more. Stars above their secrets keep as we walk on in shadows deep. Memories dance like flickering lights, guiding us through silent sights. With every step